So there you are. There it is. I'm not a forester. I don't work 100% within woodland. I'm just a general, I suppose, working in an environmental field. But I have been doing so for about 33 years. And there's a number of issues that are rising as we push towards planting more trees. And that's not just Belfast Hills, and it's not just in this country, but across the world. There's a big push towards planting trees for various reasons. And it's very trite to say that we need to plant the right tree in the right place, but it's a key issue, and there are a number of factors that we need to take into consideration. What I'm not going to be doing is telling you that we should plant willow in wet areas, or where we should be planting hedgerows. Nothing specific. I'm talking about the more general key issues about, and probably some of the, as I call them, the sacred cows of what we have been thinking over the last few decades are the right trees to plant in the right place. For those of you who are not aware of the Belfast Hills Partnership, we're trying to improve the management of those hills that are to the north and west of Belfast. And this is a great image to start off with, both in terms of looking right down along that escarpment of basalt that hems Belfast in as far as the north and west is concerned. But it's also a great slide to start in terms of talking about trees and talking about woodland. For those of you who haven't recognized it yet, you're looking down at the zoo. You can see the old floral hall, but it still had its roof on. In amongst the zoo, you can see there's a few amenity trees planted. But I suppose the most interesting part of that image is that woodland over to the right. That is ancient woodland. That's hazelwood. That's a rather steep, sharply cut escarpment covered in hazel, oak, and quite a bit of sycamore coming in. So that is woodland that's been there for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Even though it looks quite similar, all that woodland to the left, that's coming up from the Cave Hill Country Park, that has only been planted in contrast since the 1860s. There are old images of and old postcards of Belfast Castle sitting on a virtually treeless slope. So big difference between what's been there for hundreds or thousands of years, that ancient woodland up at Hazelwood and the woodland to our left. It's a bit more difficult to see, but if you look up towards the top right, you'll see there's some woodland just above the uplands, and that's conifers. They've been planted for wood production, really, and from a landscape point of view. Dotted on the uplands, you'll see there's the odd bit of scrub. That's very important from a biodiversity point of view. And over to the left, if you look well past that woodland, you'll see in the distance, that's Cliftonville. I think it's Cliftonville Golf Course, and there's trees planted in there. So even just with that one image, there's a few other places I could mention. You'd see some other parks in the distance in the middle of the city. Various trees planted in different places. The right tree in the right place. The unmentioned phrase is for what purpose. So it depends what you're trying to do with those trees, and of course that's a big question. Again, for those who are not too sure exactly where we're talking about, it's that line of uplands to the west and north of Belfast. And the great majority of the Belfast Hills is not covered in woodland. Our woodland tends to be along the city edge. And there's an image of where we see our woodland as being. Don't worry about the purple. The purple is the publicly accessible bits of woodland. So you can see there's a whole scattering along the edge of the city of mostly broadleafs. There's some darker patches are the conifers, and you can see both a mixture of old parkland, and those old estates with the large houses. The people who were rich used to love to build their houses up on the foothills overlooking Belfast. So we've got lots of different areas that are have been planted up as parkland. So we've got an array of different sorts of woodland. The one thing I'd like you to notice is how it almost connects up, but there are various gaps, and that's very important from the point of view of what we're trying to do now. Belfast Hills Partnership, we've been in place since 2004, and we've been planting for various reasons. Those reasons have gradually changed over the years. This is planting up just off the Horseshoe Bend and on the Upper Crumlin Road quite a few years ago. We always have been planting from a biodiversity point of view, trying to, in particular, link up woodland and hedgerows. You'll have heard, I'm sure many of you will realise that we're living in a part of the world that's got very little woodland compared to certainly most of the other parts of Europe. So we're trying to up that, or have been trying to up that percentage. We've been planting it also from a landscape point of view. It's not just from a wildlife point of view, but actually from how it affects the landscape. And certainly one of the things about the Belfast Hills is that you can see it from Belfast, and it has quite an impact. Mostly it's the visitors that mention the value in having that backdrop. Of course, we're not just a two-dimensional backdrop, but it's important that we look at our woodlands from a landscape point of view, as well as from a biodiversity point of view. Coming up to more modern times, we're immediately starting to think of planting from a carbon sequestration, from capturing carbon point of view, and that's becoming more and more important, as is flood alleviation. As we, and goodness knows, in the last couple of few nights anyway, the amount of rain that we've been having, we're supposed to get heavier and wetter winters, and we need to try to prevent that. And one of the cheapest ways of doing that is to plant woodland that will hold back surface water and flows, those peak flows that are coming down the streams and rivers from the hills. And it's always been assumed by, well, certainly by quite a lot of people, if you want to improve the environment, just plant more trees. The number of people that phone us up, usually when the start of summer, when the planting season's over, and saying, look, I've got a group, we want to plant some trees. Can you give us some trees, and where should we plant them? And that's one of the questions that I want to really dig down into and just investigate. Is planting more trees always the way to improve the environment? And as you might expect, it's a bit more complicated than that. There are a number of issues to consider. I actually did this slide a couple of years ago, and I think it's changed a little bit on it, but there are some things that are relatively obvious to when you think about it. It's not a good idea to plant on peat, and that's one of the big issues as far as some of the past planting of certainly Sitka spruce plantations on uplands, on peat bogs, on what might have been viewed as waste ground. So that's one of the givens. Now, we might challenge some of the givens tonight, but that's one of the obvious things. Another pretty obvious thing, as far as some people are concerned, is that we should. It's always better to plant native species, broadleaves. Of course, there's Scots pine as well as native, as far as we think anyway. The more local the stock, the better. We have planted some species and that are native, and some that are related, that come from Hungary, that actually are coming from stock from very far away. And you then run into problems, particularly from a biodiversity point of view. It's always cited that there are, for instance, insects that lay eggs on certain species of trees. Those caterpillars hatch, and they need to be hatching at exactly the right time whenever the buds start to open, so they can get their way in. And if they're on the wrong sort of alder, for instance, or whatever the species is, that doesn't happen. So it's always better to use local stock. But as you'll see later, I'm going to be asking, is that really what we need to do now? We need to look at how that planting affects carbon in terms of, does it release carbon? There still are proposals that you plough land before you plant up. And then, of course, there's what's the biodiversity value of those habitats? This is an old picture. There you are, Peter. But what's the value of that grassland? And should we be planting trees on it? And that's becoming more and more of an issue. And it becomes more of an issue because people assume we know what is growing on different areas, that we've surveyed every field in the hills and across Northern Ireland and know which ones are of high value or low value, and that's just not the case. Connectivity, as I mentioned, how you connect up. If you're going to plant a hectare of woodland, if it's sitting out in its own, it's of a certain value, but if it connects up different woodland so that those mammals species, those bats, those insect species can travel from one woodland to the next, you're making that much more resilient. And you can see just behind at the back of that image, you can see that there's parts of that hedgerow that have been clipped back. So that's a gap that we need to look at, as well as looking at how you connect up our overall woodland. Another quick thing to think about is wildfire resilience. When you're talking about some of those areas adjacent to urban areas, what do we plant that is going to be resistant to wildfire? There are tree species that go up very quickly, poplar, for instance, and then there are other species that are very slow to burn. And there are areas across Europe, across the world, that people never thought would burn. Particularly in an urban environment, and sometimes they think that woodland is actually quite resistant to wildfires, but when it goes up, it goes up. So that's something that we need to consider, particularly whenever we're planting trees that will be mature in 40, 50 years' time. But that's something that we'll talk about. Here's another particular issue that we've had in the hills, is this picture was quite old, those plastic tree guards. Certain partners, such as the Woodland Trust, don't put up plastic tree guards anymore. There are areas in the hills, I'm very glad to say, we've got good, healthy populations of hares. So that's actually a bit of an issue for us in terms of hares love young trees. That's a particular issue, but we have to move away from plastic. And in fact, the use of wood instead of plastic is another thing to consider in terms of how we're going to produce local wood. One of the most important things about issues to consider when we're planting trees is, will this woodland be looked after, not just for the next 5 years, 10 years, 50 years? And that's a key bugbear and issue for us. So many people think you go up, you plant your trees, and that's the job done. And it might be a hard way of putting it, but if you think of those saplings as baby trees, to go up and plant those trees and not to know how those are going to be managed and looked after, it's a bit like leaving the baby in the labour ward. We need to look after, not just plant woodland, but we need to look after that. And that also means that we need to look after the existing woodland that we have better. And that, for instance, I'll talk a little bit later about invasive species, etc. There's a number of sacred cows that in my time have always been taken as read. There's always been this idea, especially earlier in my career, that all habitats tend towards woodland. That comes from studies where they've taken an area, let's say of grassland, they put a fence up, leave it to Mother Nature, and eventually you start to get saplings starting to appear, woodland starting to appear, and there's been some quite famous long-term studies, and virtually all of those go towards woodland. So that has reinforced the idea that woodland is the final habitat when you get to a succession of grassland to scrub towards woodland. So there's this idea that virtually all of our land would turn to woodland if we didn't manage it for anything else. There's the basic mantra which I've grown up with is that native is best. You always plant native, and you always plant as local stock as possible. And that's always been a given from our line of work anyway. There's what you might expect in terms of lack of judgment, I suppose, in terms of or prejudice in terms of habitats. We should be treating all habitats as equal and be looking after all our habitats equally. And when things get difficult in terms of how we're going to manage ground, then that starts to creak depending on what we're trying to do. And there's this general idea that trees are brilliant for the environment. And it's a bit trite to say, but trees are brilliant for the environment in the right place for the right reason. So those are the things I'm going to look at in a bit more detail, and with a bit of a questioning attitude towards all of these. It's true that especially where we live, that a lot of our habitats do tend towards woodland. That's even backed up by history. It even gets quite political. Even in folklore, there's always mention of the fact that whenever our woodlands were being felled in the 1600s, it's actually been cleared 2 or 3 times, believe it or not. But whenever there was a loss of woodland and a high amount of clearance of woodland, there's always this talk about squirrels being able to jump from one tree stump to the next, all the way from Lough Neagh to the north coast. And certainly that whole area between the Belfast Hills and Lough Neagh was once a massive woodland called Colulta, and that was cleared in the 1600s. There's a lot of you can talk about linking it with the plantation and all the political implications. Really, the big push was money, and a lot of that was cleared. But there have been more recently questions asked about this idea that, you know, if you leave that our land to Mother Nature, that it would all start towards woodland, and we're starting to get a very different view of that. One of the things that I will mention in particular is the pollen studies that have been done up in the hills. I've mentioned this in some of the previous talks. The person on the right was Professor Valerie Hall, who really pushed this from a Queen's point of view. So this is where you can see both of them are standing in basically what would have been a pond a few thousand years ago. It looks like a pond there now, actually. So they've just taken a core of peat, and what they were hoping for was a big long core of peat. And the reason why they're doing that is so that they'll look at take tiny slithers of this and try to work out, going back thousands of years, what the local landscape was like. They couldn't actually use this because, can you see in the extreme right, it's that light grey colour. That shows that this was a pond of mud, and so the actual peat core from this wasn't useful. What they can do, which I find is absolutely fascinating, is when they take the tiny little slithers and segments from that core, and they look at that, they not only are they looking at the pollen, but they're also looking at dating this exactly. Can you remember? I should have looked this up. I think it was about 10 years ago, the volcanic eruption in Iceland, and how it grounded all the plains because of the microscopic bits of glass that were being produced by those volcanic eruptions. Well, Valerie Hall, who was in that picture, actually pioneered a way to wash out those tiny little segments that have those glass bits in it, and look at the chemical signature of that. So they could actually date those individual parts of that core to right to the very year. So they could say, given the chemical composition of that glass, that was Thecla 1253 BC. So they could get a definite date of that peat. Now, what's the benefit of that? That means that they can build up an entire picture of how the landscape and in particular tree cover has changed as we go through. I know that is a horrible image to show you, but I'll try to explain a little bit of it. All I want you to concentrate on is the lower section, and using a 2-meter core from Divis up in the middle of the Belfast Hills, we could see that early on it wasn't woodland that dominated, it was sedges, grasses, and low-growing herbs, and that was just after the Ice Age. I'll show you a slightly better image here. Run along the top, you can see there's 10,000 right along to the right, 3,750 years before present. So that's a story that takes you through more than 6,000 years. Okay, and that's just going along the depth of that 2-meter peat core. And if you look down the right, you'll see, and I'll take you through it, that's juniper, then willow, birch, pine. So that's the first things that start to appear after the Ice Age. So that's the first woody species you start to get. So there's a period whenever it's more like tundra. You're starting to get pine coming in first. Then you can see hazel coming in, and hazel's always stayed with us. Hazel's the tree, if you think it's a tree, in the Belfast Hills. Then you get oak, elm, alder. That's your main tree species. The thing to look at is where you got the dotted lines to the right. That little section there, where suddenly you start to see the pine disappearing, etc. That's whenever farming came in. So that's roughly speaking 6,000 to 4,500, something like that there. That's whenever people started to have an effect on the environment. Those trees started to disappear for the first time on this island. It has happened, as I say, a couple of times. And then you start to see the sedges, the non-trees, as it were, starting to appear. And you're starting to see Kaluna, that's heather, finally starting to appear near the end of that period. So that means that whenever you look across the hills and you look at that heather, that's been created by people. It's not a natural habitat, and we've got very little in the way of natural habitat anyway. If people are asking me where to go to look for high quality grassland and wildflower meadows, I'll point them more towards Slieve na Cloy. But even Slieve na Cloy, when you look at that and you think that this has always been a lovely grassland. This is the report from the early 1830s, whenever the first Ordnance Survey was done. And it turns out that whole entire area was covered by a really deep bog. It was one of the very first bogs that was cut over. It's saying here 16 foot. And in amongst all of that bog, large quantities of oak, alder, etc. So it hasn't always been a high value grassland. And before that, it was bog, and before that, it was covered in woodland. Okay, so the next time you're up in hills, and this is true for a lot of the uplands right across the whole British Isles, those areas that you think are wild, natural, have always been like that. Those were covered in trees at one time. But the idea that that the trees were covered everywhere is something that's recently been challenged. So let's just go through that again. This is coming from a fantastic book, Atlas of the Irish Rural Landscape by Our House. So just after the Ice Age, bare, almost a bit like the tundra further north around the Arctic Circle. Fairly quickly, trees come in one at a time, one species at a time, pine first, etc. So around 6,000 BC, you have virtually what seems to be virtually, the idea is that it's virtually all woodland cover. And it's only whenever we came to really the late Neolithic, Bronze Age, etc., that we started to see areas being cleared. Partly because they were starting to have metal axes, so we were starting to go down and clear these areas. But generally, it was thought that these are areas that are cleared within a massive woodland area. That's been challenged, and if there's one thing I would really recommend, it's looking on YouTube for this guy here, Frans Vera. He's a Dutch ecologist, and he was looking at areas that have been recently reclaimed from the sea and other areas in the Netherlands. And this whole idea that it was virtually all covered in woodland sort of ignores the fact that there are herbivores. You had, in the case of the Netherlands, you had ancient cattle, aurochs. You've got wild horses, you've got deer. Now, the one thing you do when you're planting up a new bit of woodland is you make sure you don't let livestock in, because the livestock will eat your saplings. So if you let sheep, for instance, into a woodland, they'll eat the saplings. If that keeps happening, you're going to lose the next generation, and gradually your woodland's going to disappear. And what we're now starting to think, instead of the whole place being covered in woodland, we're starting to think that actually you had a real dynamic change between grassland that was well grazed by wild herbivores, and it's only where you have, for instance, blackthorn, bramble, hawthorn, those plants that are thorn because of to avoid the herbivores, and then you have some of the trees growing within those patches, that you'd get gradual development of sub-woodland, and then that disappearing again, and it's going back and forth. Very dynamic compared to this idea that everything marches slowly and inexorably towards woodland. And as I say, that's one really interesting read. There's some great YouTube videos of them talking. There's a little fly in the ointment as far as applying all this to here, because we didn't have aurochs. We don't actually think we didn't have wild horses. We even there's a question as to whether in the earlier times we had deer, or whether deer were actually brought in by people. So we may have been like that, but certainly the idea that you've got this long-term permanent woodland everywhere, we're beginning to wonder whether that's the case, because we've had all the range of wildflower species and different habitats that are well represented in the pollen record as well. So it's not just covered in woodland. The next point I'm going to talk about is that native is the only sort to plant, but I'm going to take just a quick opportunity for you to nip the loo or make a cup of tea, and maybe I should stop sharing there. So, Elaine, do we have any particular questions in the chat?
There's nothing in the chat, but if anybody wants to unmute themselves, but just be aware that we are recording at the minute, so if you want to keep your camera on or off, it's up to yourself.
So I can just keep this to a couple of minutes, but if anybody's got any immediate questions, I'm happy to take them, or we'll just take a quick break.
Hi, Jim.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was looking at the pollen chart you had there, and I noticed that the alder seemed to be very little alder until about something like 1,500 years ago or something like that.
Yeah.
What was the reason for that?
You've got to remember that that's only up in the Belfast Hills, but actually alder, there's a period of time called the alder period, believe it or not, and it was a time when a lot of people abandoned the uplands and Belfast Hills. What's called during the Iron Age, let's say 500 BC to 500 AD, that was a particularly wet period, and that's one of the periods whenever alder really took off, because it's a wet-loving plant. As you say, it started to emerge well before that, but it's really interesting that you've actually got a period called the Alder Age. It's reckoned that perhaps half the world's, or half Europe's population died due to the crop failures and subsequent plagues. And that's at a time whenever alder was starting to emerge, and was a clear sign that all wasn't well from that point of view. Yes, there's a marked succession of species, and it's almost representing what you see when you're traveling right from the tundra down. You start going into the pine forest, you start to see a bit of juniper, and right down. But I think alder is one of the later species that appear. I don't know the exact reasons for that, and it would be a good idea to look at some of the more general research that's done in terms of the order of trees and how they appear. But alder certainly has quite an impact in and around the Iron Age, but it's appeared maybe 1,000 years before. Who knows? And one of the things that we don't really account for in that record is the fact that there are tree diseases that appear and wipe out different species. And of course, we think that's a pretty modern phenomenon due to our greatly increased movement of materials. Of course, we have Dutch elm disease, and we've got the other diseases, but it could well be that you did have tree diseases coming in the past, and that could have an effect as well. I do think that that's quite indicative of certainly the rest of the uplands, and the British Isles in particular, that alder came in just a little bit later than the rest of them. Okay. Any other questions? Oh. Right, okay.
There's one in the chat there. Do you want me to read it out?
Please do.
Yeah, so I've just been awarded a small woodland grant. Do we need to use plastic rabbit guards and bamboo stakes with the new trees? We don't have an issue currently with rabbits or hares, and the area will be stock proof.
Gosh, that's a hostage to fortune as far. Right, you'd need to be very sure that you don't have an issue. I would be very. Let's just talk in general about protection of that. You'd need to be very sure that you don't have a problem. I'm just saying that there are places where we're trying to plant without using plastic guards, and we're getting quite high mortality rates due to hares, but we don't want to use plastic guards. To the degree, it's up to yourself. The Woodland Trust in particular are trying to look at non-plastic guards, trying to use wool, etc. I'm just very nervous about saying, oh, try it and see, and then the majority of your trees get clipped. So it depends whether you planted already or not. But that's a difficult one. Species, and it might be a wee bit late for you, but there are different species that are more attractive to hares in particular, but also to rabbits. That's a difficult one. It's going to be up to yourself. Seek as much advice and phone up the likes of the Woodland Trust and ask them. There may be alternatives that are out there. They've tried a few non-plastic ones. They're still looking for the right one. Okay, is there another one there, Elaine?
There is, yep. It says, how do we make this accessible to people within the Belfast communities? Would planting native trees in gardens boost connectivity at the very least?
Right, yes, well, we need to keep pushing that. We're just getting involved with the engagement end of 1 million trees. And there's a tree strategy for Belfast that includes engagement. So we've just been talking about doing this today. So yes, we'll be doing it through there. I just do a bit of a sales pitch here for the tree strategy. I think around January that's going to go out for consultation and just highlight those exact information, those exact points. But yes, it's amazing what can be done in terms of people's gardens. A substantial part of any city, but also particularly parts of Belfast, is in gardens. When you're up in the hills and looking across, there are parts of the hills that just look like woodland because of the amount of trees, not just in trees, but also in gardens and parks. So yes, that's a big long-term push that we need to keep at. Okay. So I'm sure there's a couple of other questions there, Elaine.
There's a few more coming in. If you want to wait maybe to the end or go on ahead with the
just
talk.
one more, and then we'll get stuck in, and we'll take all the resties at the end. Okay.
Yeah. So the next question was from Leo, who said, "I joined late. Will we be able to get this recording?" Hopefully, Leo. As long as the technology plays ball with us. And secondly, how do you test to see if there's peat in a boggy area? I'm looking at planting willow and alder around the perimeter of a small bog.
There's I'm just looking to see what there's a simple probe that you can get, and that gives you some indication of peat depth. Spade, turn it over. If it looks peaty, don't plant. But you'll find it sounds like it's nice and simple. The areas that there's no peat, there'll be a wee bit, and then it gets deeper, and you'll find it goes back and forth and back and forth. But so do your best to just keep heading out with the spade. Put it all back when you're finished, but do your best to plant on the non-peat areas. Okay. All right. So listen. I'm going to dive into this. I'm going to be hanging around for as long as people want to ask questions after. So I'll get stuck into the second part if you don't mind. Mute yous all. And share again. Oh, it looks like I've gone back to, let me just go back to where I was. Okay, you see that okay? So I was talking about native is the only sort to plant. And I have to say that even if I question this, it's going to be very hard for me personally or Belfast Hills to move away from this. But perhaps from a regional and a national point of view, we really need to question every aspect of what we think we hold to be true. Where there are places that are much worse than us. I remember Florida has, I think it's getting towards 50% of the species that they have are non-native, are alien species. So we have some species that have been brought in that are completely taken over and causing great damage to various habitats. Japanese knotweed, laurel. We're getting laurel in amongst a lot of our woodlands, and we have very active volunteer groups and other groups. I was just going to mention, for instance, there's the group at the old Colin Wood. There's a group that are really getting stuck in to try to get rid of laurel, which takes over, and you suddenly lose all your bird species, etc. Your insects all start to disappear when laurel takes over. Himalayan balsam, all sorts of plants, probably brought in for their value from a gardening point of view. This is winter hellebore that's now spreading through thrown wood. Garden plants that have gone out and are starting to take over. Some of them are easier to control than others. Did you notice the wee trick one that I put in? Here we're talking about how bad these alien invasive species are. Potato, our national plant, you might say, South American. Try to think of a food plant, a crop that is native, and you'll struggle So it's all right to say, look, these species that are being brought in, these invasive species, are causing a disaster. But we depend on these non-native species that we're crops. So how do we fit those two things together? I'm not suggesting we forget about how we're going to fight our Japanese knotweed and Himalayan balsam problems, but we can't just think that everything non-native is bad and everything native is good. Some of the biggest problems that we have are with stuff that is native. Bracken, for instance, you only have to look at the front of the Black Mountain at this time of the year and look at the brown areas and know we have a big problem in terms of bracken, particularly where we lose the farming, the grazing, then we get real problems coming in. Gorse. This picture is actually, it's a bit of a false one. This is New Zealand. This is gorse from here and what it does to places such as New Zealand. So it works both ways, I suppose. So we have native species that are invasive. So it's a matter of control, and that there's also non-native species that we have that don't particularly cause problems. It's just a little bit more complicated than a simple native, non-native. It doesn't mean to say that native isn't more worthwhile, particularly from a biodiversity point of view. But we need to think about what we want from our land. Sitka spruce. There are many people who are dead set against Sitka spruce. There are, I'm thinking of some of the Midland counties, the amount of conifer plantation completely changing the farming communities, completely changing the landscape, but producing wood. And there are woodlands. If there's one thing about spruce plantations and conifer plantations, you may look at it and go, oh, that shouldn't be there. You see, when they're taken down, there are places where we're losing good nesting areas, good line-up areas from a mammal point of view. And the other question is, if we don't have those plantations, how are we going to produce the wood that we need? I'm not answering that question. I'm just posing it in terms of what are we going to do from a woodland production point of view. Then there are those areas that are for recreation, maybe even historically planted non-natives. Do we take all those down and plant alder and plant willow? That may be going too far. There are plenty of areas where if there's specifically areas for recreation, for parkland, there are areas that are still planting non-native and our own gardens. And sometimes when you're planting for pollinators, etc., some of the non-native stuff is better. But all I'm doing is saying, look, that sacred cow of only plant native. We have to think hard about what direction we would go as far as that's concerned. I'm thinking in particular of the big issues that we have when disaster we have in terms of tree disease. Ash dieback, many of you will see, never mind know, about the impacts that we're going to see in across our countryside. 60% of the broadleaves in our hedgerows are ash. Things are looking a little bit better in terms of the percentage mortality. It looks like some of them are surviving, but it's still going to be an incredible change, and an incredible change both from a landscape point of view, a biodiversity point of view. It's really literally changing the look of our countryside. And that changes our attitude to certain species. And there's another fact that some people are a bit uncomfortable with. When you have a broadleaf woodland that has some conifers in it, it seems to be that there is more biodiversity. It's just that that heterogeneity, those conifers, when you see it in action, you can see that those conifers are great places during the winter for birds to roost. Not saying that it should be 50-50 or anything like that there, but actually and of course we do have our own Scots pine, for instance, but you know, we need to think hard about existing woodlands that we have, for instance, that have some conifers, and they may not be the first thing to take out as far as that's concerned. So that's a fact that doesn't sit well with its simplistic native broadleaves are the only thing to have. Sycamore is a great example of a species where there's now quite a lot of controversy. Earlier, 20 years ago, sycamore was a real no-no in terms of planting for biodiversity. If you've ever seen a car that's been parked underneath a sycamore tree in the summertime, covered in this sticky sap, you'll know that that's the aphids that you get on sycamore. I think there's about 2 species of insects that feed on sycamore, and that compares to, well, there's wide figures given for oak or native oak. It could be 100 species, it could be 200 species. So that was one of the main reasons why whenever you start getting some sycamore in woodland, it used to be we would be desperately trying to get rid of the saplings in particular. It's incredibly prolific. But there's reasons for why sycamore has been planted. It's good from a wood production point of view, but it's great from a shelter point of view. This is the home that I was brought up in. That window there is the window to my bedroom, and out sitting right in front of us is this multi-stemmed sycamore tree. So I would look out there, and that's where I started to get interested in wildlife and birds, looking at all the birds that are in there. There's one of the branches down at the bottom here that has the old horseshoes that were put there by my grandfather and probably my great-grandfather. So there's an attachment to sycamore. Sycamore is always a good tree to plant around a farmhouse. That's why they're sitting up on the hatchet field. So there's a bit more to it than just, listen, sycamore is a non-native. And now where you get a mixed woodland and the ash is starting to die back, suddenly we're looking at the sycamore and thinking, now's not the time to take the sycamore out. The sycamore is providing cover. It's encouraging those woodland plants and understory that we need to keep a hold on to. So we'll deal with the dying and dead ash. We'll try to replant, and the sycamore will play a sort of nursery role as far as that's concerned. Just sticking to home a wee bit more. That's primarily a Sitka spruce plantation that my uncle put in. And this was in 1988, 1989. And I actually was the guy that was left to plant the broadleaves. So that line of broadleaves that you see there is what I planted. It's getting scary from an old age point of view to see some of the size of some of the trees I used to plant many, many years ago. But one of the things, uncomfortable things to point out is the size of this Sitka spruce compared to the broadleaf. And definitely slower growing, different type of tree. Take a look at that big field that we in front and go forward another few years and we've planted all of that in broadleaf. That's another brother of mine. But you'll see that we're already taking out some of that wood from the Sitka plantation. Unfortunately, a substantial amount of the broadleaf we put in is ash. We also, one of my brothers thought it'd be a great idea to put in eucalyptus as well, and the frost of 2011 soon put paid to that. But that's a view of it. There's this Sitka plantation to your right, and you'll see there's a little bit, you can see those areas where some of the broadleaves have been put in, and then you'll see where we've put in the our broadleaves, and there's quite a bit of ash down there. That actually, those brown areas, I think that's also a bit of larch as well. But as we move away as quickly as possible from using plastic, you'll all have seen wooden spoons, wooden alternatives. Where and how are we going to meet our needs in terms of wood production? Do we really want to import all of our wood? I have no answer to this because it's not easy to come up with an answer. But what are we going to do as far as what local wood production? What can we do and what can't we do? We won't be able to produce everything that we need from a wood point of view. I always feel sorry for foresters who are planting in the 40s and 50s that we're told, look, this would produce our own wood so that we're getting towards more towards self-sufficiency. They were trying to do the job that they were told to do, and that's the terrible thing about if you plant wildflower meadow and you get it wrong, you can always replace it 2 or 3 years later. When you plant woodland, you're trying to work out what's going to work and what's going to be useful and the best thing, not for now, but for 50, 100 years time. So can native meet our needs as far as woodland's concerned? Big question. And does it also meet our needs from a carbon sequestration point of view? If we really have to push hard in terms of capturing more carbon, what are the best species of trees that will do as far as that's concerned? Just point out, there's the bits of woodland we planted. Just below that, you'll start to see there's some rougher woodland. That's our bog. So you can see that's the spruce plantation there. This was part of, we're quite close to Ballinahone bog. This is part of our bog. And you can see, because of past drainage, we're starting to get birch and then follow on trees starting to colonize that peatland, which is a disaster. And it's a disaster because that peatland is containing and storing so much, just for one particular aspect, is storing so much carbon compared to the woodland. So certainly in terms of storing carbon, all habitats aren't created equal. So that is a disaster, and one that we're very hard pushed in terms of what we can do as far as that's concerned. So all habitats aren't quite created equal. It depends what you want that habitat to do. And of course, in this particular circumstance, those trees, the birch in particular, are drying up that peatland. There's a vicious circle in terms of all those leaves on those trees give out so much more water, transpiration. So those trees are playing a part in really damaging that peatland, and that's a bit of a shame, and it's very, very hard to work out what to do. They're having a hard time controlling the woodland that's encroaching on to Ballinahone, which is just about half a mile down the road. So trying to do something in that's a problem. Trees are brilliant depending on what you want them for. And this is one of the most contentious issues is, are we planting on ground that's both already great stores of carbon in terms of permanent pasture and wildflower areas? And are we doing enough to judge what the quality, what type of habitat we're planting on? Certainly in the past, we didn't do that. And these old pastures can be locking in so much more carbon, and of course having so much more biodiversity and wildlife than regularly planted and restocked ryegrass or whatever. So, and these are habitats that are really starting to disappear. And of course, it's easy to say, but we've got to hold on to them all. I'm showing this. I hope this is the right place that I was brought to 25 years ago. It's a sad tale. I think it's this area of woodland here. I was brought to this. It's in another part of the world. It's before my times in the Belfast Hills, to be shown the new trees that they had planted. And in amongst all these trees were growing all these orchids. So it was obviously the wrong place to plant. But we've got such a demand on, or such a need for carbon sequestration that maybe we can't be completely 100% staying away from these areas. If you've got a big field and it's got a couple of hundred orchids in it, yeah, you shouldn't be planting on it. But what if it's got 2? What do we do as far as that's concerned? Where do we draw the line? It's not easy. Now this is a bit of a cheat because we're talking about a non-native species, but one of my favorite walks is through a beech woodland. And if you're thinking that, you know, trees are always good, great areas to walk through. 2 things: beech, a wee bit like sycamore, have very, very little in the way of a range of insects. And if there's no insects, there's less things to for the birds to feed on. So usually when you're walking through a beech woodland, it's very quiet from a bird point of view compared to the more mixed broadleaf woodlands. So it tends to be that little bit more dead. The other thing that beech does, you know, it's a fight for survival as far as these trees are concerned. Take a look at the ground. That is covered in beech mast. It's covered in old beech leaves from previous years. Those have a chemical in it that kills or suppresses seedlings of most other species apart from beech. I think there's plantain as well as another one that manages to escape it. So that, it's a war. They're trying to kill all the understory except for the beech seedlings. And that's quite important from a flood alleviation point of view, because trees with large leaves really hold a lot of water back and slow down that your rivers getting high. But also it's the understory. It's all those plants, whether it's bluebells and red campion or small trees like elder and holly, that really slow down that water flow. And that's where woodland becomes such an asset in terms of slowing down floods that we're going to see more of. And we're going to see more of floods, don't you worry. A lot of those sacred cows that I'm talking about really date from 30 or 40 years ago, or we're taken as read even longer than that. We're living in a very, very different world. This is, I think, from Pakistan. So we're seeing floods as we've never seen them before. We're also seeing wildfires in areas that and the intensity of wildfires that we've never seen before. This is Canada, and we've been sitting for a number of years thinking that we're not too badly off, but we will see greater, wetter winters. What are we going to do about avoiding flooding? I'm just in the process of downsizing, and I'm looking at the flood maps, not where the sea is going to increase, but the actual flood maps where they're paying flood payments and where not to move. And there's been a couple of streets that I've noticed there's sandbags in, and I'm going to avoid them because things are going to get worse. It's the same for the wildfires. Those areas that you think would never have burnt are starting to burn. We're going to see drier and more intense drought periods, and depending on, we're relying on farmers to graze areas to prevent that buildup of fuel. And if you get a combination of grazing not being financially viable again, then we're going to run into real problems as far as that's concerned. What are we going to do if our climate becomes like France? Depending on whether you look at north of France or south of France, that seems to be the way we're heading. This is a list of all the native trees in France. The green ones are the ones that we share with them. The red ones aren't. If in 50 years we're going to have, it used to sound fanciful, we're going to have a climate something similar to the south of France, are we going to just stick to holding on to the native trees that we have? Or is it realistic to think that those non-native species will spread up naturally? I don't think so. So what are we going to do? What trees are we going to plant? And what trees are we going to plant that are going to be mature in 30, 40, 50 years' time? I know from a Belfast Hills point of view that we're going to keep planting native, but maybe from a national point of view and from a regional point of view, we've got some difficult decisions to make. All we need is some strong political leadership, and that's another thing that I don't think is we've got in terms of modern politics, and people going to stick their necks out. I'm not saying we should plant all sorts of more European beech and downy oak, etc. But you know, we've got to take a serious look at what our current planting of natives is going to mean. Bigger question, and it gets harder the bigger these questions get. How are we going to manage our land? Because it's not just about woodland. And there's a few scary figures. Obviously, we need to greatly increase our carbon sequestration. We need to plant more woodland. But what species? I've just talked about that. Think about what is going to happen in 50 years' time. Another statistic, and this was a UK statistic, we're going to lose 3% of our farmland to urban use in the next, I think it's 20 years. I'm not 100% sure about that figure. 3% doesn't sound very much, but if that's just to urban, into concrete, and we're also talking then about renewable energy, solar farms, what are we going to, and if we're talking specifically about planting trees on farmland, are we going to plant it on the marginal farmland, which is probably the best from a biodiversity point of view? Or are we going to plant it on good farmland, very good farmland, where the trees will grow much quicker and will sequester much more carbon? But of course, there's lots of other things we need the farmland for. We need to increase food production while we move away from using petrochemical fertilizers. That is a big ask. That is a very big ask. When I was born, there's now 2.5 people for every 1 person on the planet compared to when I was born. Now, population and the effect of population is always extremely sensitive from a political point of view, but you know, we're heading in directions that it's getting more and more difficult to work out how we're going to manage our land. And there's only so much that our land can do. And of course, we need to protect and increase biodiversity, as well as climate coming down the railway line at us. There's loss of biodiversity and biodiversity, and what we depend on becoming more and more less and less resilient. It's quite simple to start off when you think about talking about managing our biodiversity and come up with a principle. We need to hold on to all of our habitats and species as much as we can. That in itself is proving difficult, but that's as good as a principle as we can start with. We need to make the woodlands, both the new woodlands and the woodlands that we've got, as resilient as possible, and think about how are those woodlands going to manage in any new climate that we have. And I think for too long we are getting our little nature reserves and we're preserving them and we're keeping them as in as good a nick as possible, and everything else is going to hell. So we need to think carefully about moving away from pickling it all in aspic, keeping everything exactly the way it was. And there are some bold decisions that are coming down the line. We can't do all the things that we need to do and just keep things the way we are. And remember, our land can only give us so much. It's the precious resource that we have, whether it's from a wildlife point of view, from a food production point of view, from a wood production point of view, from where to live, where to enjoy. And our land is getting under more and more pressure, and we don't have a big land strategy. But having said all of that, we've got to keep planting trees. We still need to plant the right tree in the right place. Working out what the right tree is going to be a little bit more difficult. So I'm going to end with a little bit of a sales pitch, because this Saturday we've got not one, but 2 events happening. We're tree planting in a particularly good area of Glasnevin, which is up behind the Cave Hill. It's you get to it via the Hightown Road, Mollusk direction. You have to book on these days, because we've had a couple of events where we've got 20 spades and 200 people turn up. So you need to go online to book that. But if you don't want to go to Glasnevin, we're also launching or helping to launch with Antrim and Newton Abbey another 1 million trees campaign. I think they've got 15 years as well. So there's a community tree planting event on the 3 Mile Water as well. So there's certainly plenty happening. And I hope I haven't been too depressing in terms of pointing out the reality of some of the things that are coming down the line at us. But we can't afford to stay still. We need to address those issues. So listen, that, as far as I'm aware, that's the end of that. We'll unmute you all. Elaine, do we have any particular questions?
Yep. I'll just scroll back here a bit.
I'm happy to take them from the floor as well now. Don't worry.
I'll take one now, and then if you want, I'll do the hand raising and we can go through who wants to actually speak. So going back to the guards question that we had earlier, I wonder, could you use a sacrifice type plant for them to deter them eating the saplings like they do for golden veg? Would the same principle maybe work?
It might well do. I can remember reading about that in particular. Picking your species and maybe even having a sacrifice woody species. Yes, that's possible. Whether it's going to work 100%, I mean, basically we're continuing to plant on areas and gradually we're starting to win the war. But you know, the sooner we come up with a good, viable, sustainable alternative, the better, as far as that's concerned. Yes, difficult one. But if you're always going to get, even in a good plantation, you're going to get something like 5% mortality anyway. But whenever you see an entire row nipped off by hares, that's a bit hard to take. They also, there are particular high quality saplings that are produced in pots or cells, as opposed to bare root. And for somehow or other, they manage to particularly spot them. They seem to be sweeter or something like that, and they go for those ones before they go for the bare root ones. Okay. Any other questions, Elaine?
Not so much a question as a comment, just again to do with plastic guards. If trees are planted with guards, they have to be removed later on. In the case of Carnmoney Hill earlier this year, volunteers went out to remove the guards, and luckily the weather was fine. Yeah,
you can, but yeah, it's as the Woodland Trust, they've just taken a stance that we're not going to use plastic. Yeah, we are trying to reuse as much in terms of guards that we've had historically, but we're in a position where we're doing our best not to use them. Okay. Any other questions?
Any news for 1 Million Trees project in Old Colin Wood?
Okay. Yes, Old Colin Wood's it's. I remember I was mentioning about the old estates. That was Colin House, where Frank Pantridge used to live, and that meant that there's a lot of laurel planted there. We're certainly happy to help. In particular, if there's additional laurel that needs to be removed by contractors, we'll certainly look. I'll certainly look to and check whether 1 million trees have got money to do some woodland restoration where it can assist as far as that's concerned.
We never touched it.
Okay. Any other questions? Anybody from the floor?
Jim, what do you think of the idea, of incentivizing farmers to say, have a minimum width of hedgerow? Because, after all, they're kind of like mini woodlands.
Okay.
That if farmers were incentivized to have a minimum, say 3 meters or something, and were incentivized not to cut as often, you would instantly get, an increase in woodland, and you'd get connectivity straight away.
Yeah. If anything, they're disincentivized. If they put, if you're looking for 4 meters, for instance, right, they will automatically lose their payments for 2 of those meters.
Yeah.
And if you're talking about all their hedges, that becomes a quite substantial proportion of ground, especially if you're talking about smaller fields. So it's the way it's set up is certainly up to now has been quite a disincentive as far as that's concerned. So where the few places where we're trying to get bigger, broader connecting hedges, that's a big issue, and that's one where we're trying to particularly. We're a local organisation, so we don't do too much government lobbying, but we're trying to push that in particular. And it's going to be interesting to see what changes that will happen in terms of farm support and the reasons behind it. So there's going to be big changes happening. Whether it's the right ones, and from both a biodiversity point of view and a woodland, whether they're going to be viable and whether they're going to keep farming sustainable is the big question. And it's a grave concern, particularly in marginal ground such as uplands, whether that's the priority for them and whether they're going to concentrate on food production. I mean, I can't understand why the uplands aren't a perfect example of good extensive as opposed to intensive food production. But you can imagine this is highly political, depending on what sort of sector of farming you come from. But yes, we cannot say these are the directions we need to go without making them viable, and just keeping farming viable is a big issue. And so it's actually just losing farming is going to have quite a substantial effect. And it's so important to deliver what we need from our countryside. So I know that's a big rambling answer to it, but it's already, there's a disincentive, so we need to at least remove that and reward that. If we want the farmers to do it, we need to make sure that it's viable for them to do so.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else? What's the score in the match? That's now. And I didn't even tape it. Listen, I hope that's. I'm deliberately being provocative tonight, and I'm deliberately not producing answers to some of those questions because there are no easy answers. And your particular, what's priorities for you as an individual or as somebody who's got back gardens or landowners or whatever, it all depends on what you want to do. But you can see that how we manage our ground and our uplands is going to decide what sort of world we live in. And we just got to keep going in terms of taking action, and whether or not we're taking the right action and trying to plan for 50 years ahead. I'm always assumed that we're all now see that climate change is happening. That's not everybody does. I still meet people who don't accept that that's anything other than natural. I think the last couple of years have changed a lot of minds as far as that's concerned. Okay.